All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time, we're heading back to 1985,
Oh, wow.
Montclair, California. Think quiet town, everyone knows everyone, that kind of vibe.
Okay.
And right in the middle of it all, we've got Warren Thompson,
All right.
50 years old, a family man dealing with some health issues, not exactly living the high life.
Right.
We're going to be sifting through all sorts of stuff like detective reports and court transcripts,
Mm-hmm.
even interrogation recordings, to figure out how this case went cold
Mm-hmm.
for decades. It's wild.
Yeah, this one is a really interesting look at how forensic science has changed over the years. Back in 1985, forget DNA analysis, they were relying on good old-fashioned detective work, witness statements.
Yeah, you really got to think about how different it was.
Absolutely
I mean, can you imagine trying to solve a case without all the tech we have today?
right. Right.
So let's get into Warren's life a little bit. What was he like? What was going on with him?
Well, he was working odd jobs, struggling to make ends meet, collecting scrap metal, that sort of thing.
Oh.
He had a wife, Hazel,
Okay.
a son named Val, and a 12-year-old daughter, Wendy.
Just trying to get by,
Yeah.
a real family man. And then tragedy strikes. What can you tell me about the night of the murder?
So Hazel was out for the night, bowling with friends.
Okay.
Wendy was at a youth group meeting. They both came home to their apartment around 1 a.m.
Mm.
And let's just say nobody should ever have to see what they walked in on.
Awful. Just awful.
Yeah.
So paint the picture for me. What did the investigators find?
Well, the detective's report describes this really chaotic scene.
Oh, wow.
Lights were on in every room except the kitchen, and that's where they found Warren's body. The apartment was ransacked, and get this, Warren had been stabbed 29 times in the back and neck. Brutal.
29 times.
Yeah.
That's just, that points to something way beyond a robbery gone wrong.
Ah.
You don't just stab someone that many times for a quick buck.
Exactly. I mean, the sheer number of wounds, where they were, it all screams personal rage, Like a level of anger you wouldn't typically see in a random robbery.
Yeah. There was also this bloodstained towel they found at the scene. Could mean the attacker got injured during a struggle. Okay, so they're looking for someone who knew Warren, someone who had a reason to be this angry. Any leads at all?
Well, Hazel mentioned this 20-year-old guy, Michael Bell. Apparently, he'd been hanging around Wendy, and Warren had confronted him about it, told him to stay away from his daughter.
Hold on. They thought Warren's daughter's friend might have murdered him. That's crazy. Is there anything else linking this Bell guy to the crime?
Yeah, they dug a little deeper and found out Bell had been arrested for burglarizing Wendy's school a while back.
Oh, wow. Okay, so they've got their suspect. But this was 1985, right?
Yeah.
Proving it back then was a whole different ballgame.
Oh, totally. We're talking pre-DNA era. They were relying on things like teletypes, pawn shop connections, anonymous tips, lots of legwork, hoping for a lucky break.
It's kind of amazing, right? How much detective work used to just be gut instinct and knocking on doors.
It really was a different world.
So did those old school methods pan out? Did they get anything from all those leads?
Sadly, no. The case went ice cold, leaving Warren's family without answers for years and years.
Decades, really. It's just,
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine going that long without knowing what happened to your loved one. But then, years later, a detective decides to take a fresh look at the case. What sparked that?
So in 2007, Detective Cervantes reopened the case. He realized that blood-stained towel, remember that?
Oh, yeah.
That could be the key to cracking the whole thing wide open, thanks to all the advances in DNA analysis.
Right. That's when things really started to change in forensic science.
Exactly.
So they finally had the technology to test that towel and...
They did, and they got a hit, ran it through CODIS, the National DNA Database, and boom, match.
So they found the killer through a DNA database. Wow, that's got to be, what, like a 1 in a million chance?
More like 1 in a billion.
Yeah.
The odds of a match like that are astronomical. Turns out the DNA belonged to James Wilcoxon.
James Wilcoxon.
Yeah. A homeless man living in San Jose. He'd been convicted of voluntary manslaughter back in '88, so his DNA was in the system.
So this random bloodstained towel just connects these two seemingly unrelated cases, decades apart. That's incredible. But how do you even begin to track down someone with no fixed address?
That was a hurdle for sure. But they got creative, started using social media, Facebook specifically, to see if they could find any trace of him.
Wait, Facebook? Like the place where people post vacation pictures? That helped catch a murderer.
It did. And eventually they found him, brought him in for questioning. And let me tell you, this is where the story gets really interesting. They basically had to play a very careful game with him.
Oh, I bet. This guy's been living with this secret for, what, almost 30 years? The pressure must have been insane.
Absolutely. And they knew that. So they started by just letting him talk, hoping he'd trip himself up, And that's exactly what started to happen. At first, he's all, I've never even been to Warren's apartment. But then, yeah, things start to unravel. He changes his story and says, okay, I was at the apartment, but I was just there to break up a fight.
A fight between two.
Between Warren and a stepson, he said. A stepson named Greg.
Greg, a stepson. Come on, that sounds pretty made up. Did the investigators buy that?
Not a chance. They knew Warren didn't have a stepson. Plus, there were all these inconsistencies with his story, like he describes seeing Warren face down during the supposed fight,
Right.
which didn't match up with how they found the body.
Right, yeah.
So they knew he was lying. They've got his DNA on the towel. They've got him contradicting himself. What happens next?
I've got to confront him with all that, right?
They do. And with all the evidence piling up against him, Wilcoxon finally cracks, confesses to stabbing Warren alone. No stepson, no fight, nothing. Just him and Warren.
Wow. That's a huge breakthrough after all these years. But can they actually make this stick in court? I mean, the case is like 30 years old at this point. Isn't that a problem?
Oh, yeah. It's a massive hurdle. You've got witnesses whose memories have faded, evidence that might be lost or degraded.
Right.
Even finding the original detectives can be tough. And then there's the whole question of whether a decades-old confession will hold up in court. It's definitely an uphill battle.
So what did the prosecution do? How do you even begin to tackle a case like that?
Well, the prosecutor, Denise Yoakum, she was really determined to make this work. Spent months meticulously prepping for the trial, making sure every single piece of evidence was admissible, every witness was ready to go.
That's got to be tough.
Oh, yeah. She had to anticipate the defense's every move. She figured they'd probably try to claim self-defense, saying there was a struggle, Wilcoxon felt threatened, had to protect himself, all that.
But he already confessed to stabbing Warren alone. How could they even try to pull that off?
A good defense attorney can spin things, Denise had to make sure the jury saw right through it, so jury selection was critical.
Makes sense. So how did she go about picking the right jury?
Carefully, very carefully. She really dug into their views on self-defense, looking for people who could stay objective, focus on the facts. But she also wanted to make sure they understood the context of the crime.
The context.
Yeah, like she wanted to transport them back to 1985, show them what life was like back then, the technology, the social norms, even how investigations were handled. Paint a clear picture of that era.
So she's setting the stage, creating a world for the jury to step into. What kind of stuff did she use to do that?
Oh, all sorts of things. She brought in evidence about the technology of the time, like those old rotary phones, the way people communicated.
Oh, well, that's cool.
Yeah, it really helped the jury grasp how different things were. And then, once she set the scene, she laid out her case against Wilcoxon.
Okay, so what was her opening statement like? What were the key points she hit on?
She started by highlighting Wilcoxon's history of using a knife when he was angry or needed money. She brought up his prior robbery conviction, the whole 9 yards.
Right, establishing a pattern of behavior. Smart. Did she talk about his constantly changing story during the interrogation?
Absolutely. She basically said, look, these lies, these shifting stories, they're just desperate attempts to avoid taking responsibility for what he did. And the evidence will prove it.
So she's laying it all out there. The confession, the DNA, the lies. Sounds like a pretty strong case. But then there was that bombshell in the middle of the trial, right? Something about Warren's son, Val.
Oh, yeah. That was a twist no one saw coming. Out of nowhere, Val just drops this bombshell. He says he actually knew Wilcoxon. They used to collect scrap metal together with Warren.
Wait a minute. The victim and the killer knew each other. This changes everything. What did the prosecution do with that?
Surprisingly, Denise chose not to address it directly.
Really? She just ignored it. That seems risky. What about the defense? Did they try to use it to their advantage?
You'd think they would, right. But they didn't question Val about it at all. Like, they totally missed this golden opportunity to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, maybe suggest a different motive.
Wow, that's a major fumble. It's crazy how these tiny decisions can make or break a case. So the defense drops the ball, and Denise is free to keep building her case. What happens next?
She focuses on dismantling that whole self-defense argument. She points out that most of the stab wounds were on Warren's back, which means he wasn't facing his attacker.
Yeah. If you're defending yourself, you're usually facing the person, right?
Exactly. It just doesn't add up. Plus, she hammers home the fact that there were 29 stab wounds. I mean, that's not self-defense. That's overkill.
Right, shows intent. Like he was really going after Warren.
And to top it all off, she reminds the jury that Warren's body was found cornered in the kitchen, no way out. He was trapped, hunted down.
It's like a puzzle, all these pieces coming together to show exactly what happened that night. So she pretty much shut down that self-defense argument. But did the jury buy it? Did Warren's family finally get justice after all these years? It all comes down to this, right? After the evidence and the witnesses and the closing arguments, the jury has to decide. I can only imagine how agonizing that wait must have been.
Oh, it was a nail biter for sure, especially for Warren's family, you know? After 31 years of wondering, of not knowing, they're finally on the verge of maybe, just maybe, getting some closure. And for Denise, the prosecutor, it's the moment of truth. Did she do enough? Did she convince them?
And for Wilcoxon, I mean, he's facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. So what was it like when that verdict finally came in?
The jury was out for a whole day deliberating. Can you imagine? A whole day.
Oh, man.
Must have felt like an eternity for Warren's family, but finally they had a decision, and it was guilty. James Wilcoxon was found guilty of first-degree murder.
Guilty after 3 decades. Wow. That courtroom must have been a whirlwind of emotions.
You said it. Relief, sadness, maybe even a little bit of anger. It was a bittersweet victory, you know? Especially for Hazel, Warren's wife. Finally, justice for her husband, but it doesn't bring him back.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't erase the pain of all those years. Did Hazel and the kids get a chance to speak after the verdict? To say their piece?
They did. Hazel gave a victim impact statement. Talked about how Wilcoxon's actions ripped their family apart, how they lived in fear for so long, never knowing if they'd ever get justice for Warren. Tough to hear.
And Wendy and Val, Warren's kids, they were just kids when this happened. It's hard to fathom what they went through all those years, carrying that with them.
Yeah, they both gave statements, too. Wendy spoke about finding her father's body. The memory still haunts her, understandably. Said that while the verdict brings some closure, it can't erase what happened that night. No, nothing can.
And Val, he was the last one to see Warren alive. I can't imagine the weight of that, knowing his father's killer was out there somewhere.
Yeah, he talked about that burden in his statement, that feeling of knowing but not being able to do anything. But he also talked about relief. Relief that it was finally over, that justice had been served. Said it finally allows him to start to heal.
It's a powerful story. Tragic, but powerful. Justice prevailed, but at such a high cost. This one senseless act of violence destroyed a family, created ripples of pain that lasted for decades.
It's a reminder, you know. Even in those quiet, idyllic towns, darkness can find its way in. And the search for justice. Sometimes that road is long and winding.
But this case also shows us how far we've come. The DNA evidence, Facebook even playing a role in tracking down the suspect, who would have thought?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What will the future of crime solving look like? As technology keeps advancing, what new tools will we have? But also, what new challenges will we face? How do we keep pushing forward while protecting everyone's rights?
It's a lot to consider. A lot has changed since 1985, and it's only going to keep changing. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the 1985 Montclair cold case, a story of loss, resilience, and the enduring power of truth. Thanks for joining us.